There is a verse in the Bible that most preachers skip. Not because it is obscure, not because it is difficult to translate, but because when you read it slowly, when you let the full weight of what God actually said settle into your mind, something uncomfortable happens. The earth shifts beneath you. The comfortable image of a gentle deity making polite requests begins to crack, and behind that crack, you see something older, something vast, something that does not ask. And the command it gave to one man, standing in the city of Ur 4,000 years ago, was not a blessing wrapped in warmth. It was a severance wrapped in fire. Picture the city of Ur at the height of its power. Not a village, not a camp of wandering shepherds, a metropolis of ziggurat towers climbing toward a sky thick with incense smoke, where astronomers mapped constellations that would not be rediscovered for another 2,000 years, where priests performed rituals so ancient that even they had forgotten where the rituals began. Streets of baked brick, canals carved by human hands, temples dedicated to gods whose names were spoken only in whispers after dark. This was the world Abram called home. This was everything he knew. And then, without warning, without negotiation, without a single word of explanation, the voice came. 2 words in Hebrew. And those 2 words rearranged every bloodline, every empire, every war, every prophecy that would follow for the next 4 millennia. Scholars have debated their full meaning for centuries. Mystics have wept over them. Ancient rabbis said that if you truly understood what God meant when He spoke those 2 words, you would never sleep the same way again. Because buried inside that command, inside that seemingly simple call to pack your belongings and walk into the unknown, was a declaration of cosmic war. A covenant written not in ink, but in divided flesh and supernatural fire. A promise so absolute, so permanent, so world-altering, that the forces arrayed against it would spend the next 4,000 years trying to destroy every person who carried it in their blood. What God said to Abram in Genesis 12 is not what you were taught in Sunday school. The full picture, the Hebrew beneath the translation, the ancient ritual behind the covenant, the enemies already waiting in the land of promise, the war already ignited the moment the words were spoken, that picture is terrifying. Not in a way that should drive you to despair, but in a way that should stop you completely. Because the story did not end with Abram. The patterns set in motion that day are still in motion. The same conflict, the same promise, the same opposing forces playing out right now in the world you wake up to every morning. And once you see it, you cannot unsee it. There is a moment in Genesis 12 that almost everyone reads too quickly. You have seen it before, most likely. You have heard it quoted in churches, referenced in sermons, printed on motivational posters with soft watercolor backgrounds. Go from your country, your people, and your father's household to the land I will show you. Simple, clean, inspiring. But here is what nobody tells you. The version you have been reading has been softened. The edges have been rounded off. The terror has been quietly removed. And when you go back to the original Hebrew, when you sit with those words the way they were first written, you realize that what God said to Abram was not an invitation. It was something far more unsettling than that. Stop and think about this for a moment, because the geography alone should give you pause. Abram was not a young man searching for purpose. He was a settled, established figure living in one of the greatest cities on earth, and the world that surrounded him was nothing like the primitive backdrop most people imagine when they picture the ancient Middle East. Ur of the Chaldeans was not a backwater village. It was a civilization at the absolute height of its power, with irrigation systems, written law codes, temples that functioned as banks, observatories, and government offices all at once. Archaeologists who excavated the site in the early 20th century found evidence of multi-story homes with indoor plumbing, sophisticated musical instruments, and burial chambers filled with treasures that rival anything the ancient world ever produced. Abram had roots there. He had family there. He had a life so embedded in that place that when God told him to leave, the Hebrew word used does not simply mean go. It means something closer to tear yourself away. That is the first detail the translations erase. The command was violent in it was a ripping, not a stroll. And the more you understand what Abram was being asked to abandon, the more the quiet obedience recorded in verse 4 begins to feel not peaceful, but almost impossible. The Hebrew phrase at the center of Genesis 12, verse 1, is lech-lecha, 2 words, and scholars, mystics, and rabbinical commentators have spent centuries trying to capture everything those 2 words contain. On the surface, lech means go, and lecha is a reflexive particle that intensifies the command, making it deeply personal, almost introspective. Some translate it as go for yourself. Others render it as go into yourself. The great medieval Rabbi Rashi wrote that the phrase implies a journey not just across physical terrain, but into the depths of one's own identity. Abram was not just leaving a city. He was being asked to leave everything that had defined who he was, his culture, his gods, his language, his community, the very framework through which he understood reality. That is not an inspiring call to adventure. That is an existential unraveling. And the Hebrew carries it. The English does not. But here is where it gets darker. Embedded inside this famous call in Genesis 12 is a clause that most Bible readers gloss over without realizing what it actually says. God tells Abram to leave his country, his people, and his father's house. 3 concentric layers of identity, each one more intimate than the last. Country, people, father's house. Notice the direction. It moves inward. It is not enough to leave the land. It is not enough to leave the nation. God demands that Abram sever himself even from the immediate family unit, the father's house, the Bet Av in Hebrew, which in ancient Near Eastern culture was not just a family. It was legal, economic, religious, and social structure. Leaving the Bet Av meant leaving behind inheritance rights, protection, identity, and in many cases, physical safety. God was not asking Abram to take a trip. God was asking Abram to become, in the eyes of his world, nobody. A man without a house, without a clan, without a name that meant anything to anyone. And yet, that is still not the most terrifying part. The most terrifying part is what God does not say. Read Genesis 12, verse 1 again. Slowly. Go to the land I will show you. Not go to Canaan, not go to the land flowing with milk and honey, not even go north or go west. Just go to a place I will show you later, at some unspecified point, when I decide you are ready to know. Abram had no destination. He had no map. He had no timeline. He had a voice, whether audible or interior, the text does not fully specify, telling him to abandon everything he had ever known and walk in a direction to be determined. Now ask yourself this: what kind of God makes a command like that? What kind of being demands total, irreversible departure with no concrete destination offered in return? Guard that question, because the answer changes everything about how you read the rest of Genesis. The silence inside that command is not accidental. It is architectural. There is a tradition in Jewish mysticism, rooted in the Kabbalistic commentaries, that the command of lech-lecha was not the first time God spoke to Abram. The Midrash, the ancient collection of rabbinical commentary and expanded narrative, tells a story that Genesis quietly omits. It speaks of a young Abram in his father Terah's idol shop, a boy who looked at the clay statues lining the walls and felt something hollow in his chest. A child who smashed the idols and told his father that the largest one had destroyed the others. A young man who refused the gods of Ur long before the God of Genesis ever called his name, which raises a question that the canonical text deliberately leaves unanswered. Why Abram? Out of every person alive on the earth in that generation, out of every soul, breathing in every city from Mesopotamia to Egypt, why was it this particular man who heard the voice? Why was it this particular bloodline chosen to carry the most consequential promise in human history? The Bible does not explain. It simply says, God spoke, and Abram obeyed. But the obedience itself is almost as disturbing as the command. Genesis 12, verse 4 reads, "So Abram went as the Lord had told him." That is it. No argument, no negotiation, no request for clarification. In the entire narrative, there is not a single recorded word of response from Abram before he packed his belongings and walked out of Ur forever. Compare this to Moses, who argued with God at the burning bush across multiple exchanges. Compare it to Jonah, who fled in the opposite direction entirely. Compare it to Jeremiah, who protested that he was too young and too afraid. Abram said nothing. He simply moved. And that silence, that complete, immediate, wordless compliance, is one of the most psychologically complex moments in all of Scripture, because it forces you to ask, what did Abram already know? What had he already seen, already experienced, already encountered in the darkness of Ur that made the voice of this particular God so undeniable that argument never even crossed his mind? Here's what we know with certainty. Genesis 12 is universally recognized as one of the most pivotal chapters in the entire biblical canon, the hinge point between the pre-Abrahamic world of Genesis 1 through 11 and everything that follows. Before chapter 12, the Bible is a story about all of humanity: creation, the fall, Cain and Abel, the flood, the Tower of Babel, the scattering of nations. After chapter 12, the scope narrows dramatically, permanently. It becomes the story of one man, one family, one bloodline, one covenant. The entire trajectory of sacred history collapses to a single point: a man leaving a city with his wife, his nephew, and his possessions, and then expands outward again from that point into every prophecy, every king, every war, every nation, and every word written in the centuries that follow. That is the weight of what happens in this chapter. And yet, most people read it in under 2 minutes and move on. That is exactly what we are not going to do, Because if you slow down long enough to look at what is actually written here, you will find that the verse everyone thinks they know is hiding something they were never meant to forget. Before you can understand what God asked Abram to do, you have to understand what God asked Abram to leave behind. Because the story that most people carry in their heads is wrong. Not slightly wrong, fundamentally wrong. The mental image of Abram as a simple nomad wandering through a primitive, pre-civilized world is one of the most damaging misconceptions in popular biblical understanding, and it strips the command of Genesis 12 of its full, staggering weight. Abram did not leave a desert camp. He left a world so sophisticated, so deeply ordered, so saturated with power and knowledge and darkness, that the decision to walk away from it should be understood as one of the most radical acts of defiance in human history. So let us go back. Let us rebuild the world of Ur the way it actually was, because the details matter enormously. Ur of the Chaldeans sits in what is now southern Iraq, near the modern city of Nasiriyah. When archaeologists began excavating the site in the 1920s, led by the British-American scholar Leonard Woolley, what they uncovered shattered every assumption the academic world had made about the ancient Near East. They found a city of extraordinary complexity and scale. The great ziggurat of Ur, a step temple tower that rose in multiple terraces toward the sky, was not a primitive mud structure. It was an engineered monument of fired brick and bitumen, precisely aligned with celestial coordinates designed to function as a point of contact between the terrestrial and the divine. Around it sprawled a city of tens of thousands of people, with residential neighborhoods, marketplaces, schools where scribes were trained in the world's first writing system, and harbor facilities that connected Ur to trade routes stretching from the Persian Gulf all the way to the Indus Valley. This was not the backdrop of a simple pastoral story. This was the ancient world's equivalent of a capital city. But it is what they found beneath the city that should make you pause. Woolley's team uncovered what he called the Royal Cemetery of Ur, a burial complex containing the tombs of kings and queens who died around 2,500 years before Christ. Inside those tombs were treasures of breathtaking beauty, golden helmets, lyres decorated with lapis lazuli, jewelry of a craftsmanship that would not be equaled in Europe for another 2,000 years. And alongside all of that beauty, they found something else: bodies, dozens of them. Court attendants, soldiers, musicians, servants, all arranged in careful rows, all dead. The leading theory among archaeologists is that these individuals were either killed or chose to die in order to accompany their rulers into the afterlife. This was the spiritual reality of Ur, a world where death was orchestrated as performance, where kings were treated as intermediaries between humanity and the gods, and where those gods demanded blood as the price of favor. This is the world Abram breathed in every day. This is the air that filled his lungs from childhood. The gods of Ur were not abstractions. They were vivid, demanding, and terrifying presences in daily life. The chief deity of the city was Nana, the moon god, whose temple complex dominated the skyline and whose priests controlled enormous portions of the city's agricultural and economic output. The worship of Nana was not a private, personal affair. It was a civic institution woven into the legal system, the calendar, the planting seasons, and the rituals that governed birth, marriage, and death. Every household in Ur would have maintained small idols, personal gods called Lamassu, believed to stand as protective intermediaries between the family and the greater divine powers. And the Midrashic tradition we touched on earlier, the story of young Abram smashing his father's idols, takes on a completely different dimension when you understand this. Terah, Abram's father, was not just a religious man in the way we might use that term today. He was a participant in a system so total, so all-encompassing, that to reject it was not merely irreverent, it was dangerous. Now consider the astronomy. The priests of Ur were not primitive stargazers making guesses about the night sky. They were rigorous, systematic observers who had been tracking celestial movements for generations. The Babylonian astronomical tradition, which grew directly from the culture of Ur and its surrounding cities, eventually produced some of the most accurate planetary tables in the ancient world. These were men who understood cycles of the moon to within fractions of a day, who could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable precision, and who interpreted the movements of celestial bodies as direct communications from the divine realm. In other words, the people of Ur believed that the sky was speaking, and they had developed an extraordinarily sophisticated language for listening to it. When Genesis tells us that God called Abram and later took him outside and told him to count the stars, that image would have carried a weight for Abram that it cannot carry for a modern reader unless you understand this context. Stars were not decorations. Stars were announcements. And here is the detail that almost no one discusses. Genesis 11 verse 31 tells us something that most readers pass over in 2 seconds. Terah, Abram's father, had already begun the journey. The text says that Terah took Abram and his wife Sarai and his grandson Lot and set out from Ur of the Chaldeans to go to the land of Canaan. But then, in verse 31, the journey stops. They came to Haran and settled there. Terah died in Haran at the age of 205 years. So before God ever speaks the famous words of Genesis 12, the family was already in motion. They were already displaced. They had already left Ur. Which forces a question the text does not answer directly. What made Terah leave in the first place? What happened in Ur in the years or decades before Genesis 12 opens that set this family in motion toward Canaan before the divine command was ever recorded? The Bible does not tell you, and the silence, as always, is significant. Some ancient traditions suggest that Terah's departure from Ur was not voluntary in the ordinary sense. The Midrash speaks of conflict, of persecution, of a family already marked as different, already at odds with the religious and political establishment of the city. Others point to the timing, the approximate era of Ur's first great collapse under the invasion of the Elamites and Amorites, a catastrophic event that scattered many of the city's inhabitants and ended one of the most glorious periods of Sumerian civilization. Whether Terah left because of faith, fear, political pressure, or the simple chaos of a civilization crumbling around him, the result was the same. Abram arrived in Haran already a man without a country, already partially torn from the roots that had defined his people for generations. And it was there, in Haran, in that in-between place, that the voice finally spoke with full clarity. This is why the command of lech-lecha is so much more layered than it first appears. Abram was not being asked to leave comfort. He was being asked to leave the wreckage of a world already in the process of ending and to walk towards something that had no name, no location, and no guarantee. He was being called out of the gravitational pull of one of history's most powerful civilizations, a civilization built on the worship of gods who demanded everything and promised continuity in return. And the God who called him offered something entirely different, not continuity, but rupture, not the safety of the known, but the terrifying freedom of the unknown, not a temple with walls and priests and rituals, but a voice in the open sky and a promise that made no immediate logical sense. Abram left Ur, but understand what Ur was, and you begin to understand what it truly cost him, and you begin to wonder, for the first time, whether what waited for him in Canaan was worth the price. 2 words, that is all it took. 2 words spoken into the silence of a man's life in Haran, and the entire architecture of human history pivoted on that moment. We have already touched on lech-lecha, but we have not gone deep enough yet. Because what looks like a simple command on the surface, what generations of readers have processed as a straightforward divine instruction, is actually one of the most linguistically loaded phrases in all of ancient Hebrew literature. And once you understand what those 2 words are truly doing, once you feel the full pressure of what they contain, you will never read Genesis 12 the same way again. The command does not just send Abram somewhere. It dismantles him first. It performs a kind of surgical severance on his identity before his feet ever take a single step toward Canaan. Let us go deeper into the Hebrew. The root of the word lech is the verb halach, which means to walk, to go, to move forward. But the addition of lecha, the second word, transforms the grammatical structure entirely. In Hebrew, lecha functions as what linguists call a dative of advantage or a reflexive intensifier. It makes the action personal in a way that English simply cannot replicate with a single equivalent word. When God says lech-lecha, the literal force of the phrase is closer to go, for your own sake, or go into your own self. The journey God is prescribing is not primarily geographical. It is ontological. It is a command to move toward the truest version of what Abram was created to be. And the physical departure from Ur and Haran is merely the outward expression of an inward transformation that God is initiating by force. The road to Canaan begins inside Abram's chest, not on the map. The rabbinical tradition has always known this. In the Zohar, the central text of Jewish mystical thought, the command of lech-lecha is interpreted as a spiritual awakening of the highest order. The Zohar teaches that every human soul contains within it a divine spark, what is called the neshama, and that this spark can be buried under layers of cultural conditioning, false worship, inherited fear, and the spiritual pollution of one's environment. Ur was not just a physical place for Abram, it was a spiritual weight pressing down on the neshama that God had planted in him. The command lech-lecha was, in the mystical reading, God reaching into Abram and saying, "The version of you that Ur created is not the version I designed. Come out of it. Walk away from what you have been told you are, and walk toward what I know you to be." That is not a comfortable command. That is a terrifying one. But there is another layer, and this one tends to be almost entirely overlooked in popular treatments of the text. The command in Genesis 12, verse 1, is structured in a very specific sequence. Leave your country, then your people, then your father's house. As we noted before, this moves inward, from the widest circle of identity to the most intimate. But Hebrew scholars have pointed out that this sequence is actually reversed from the logical order in which someone would physically travel. If you are leaving a place, you first leave your house, then your neighborhood, then your city, then your country. The order God gives is backwards. You leave the country first, then the people, then the house. Some commentators suggest this is because God is describing not a physical departure, but a psychological one. And psychologically, the hardest thing to leave is always the innermost circle. The country can be left in a day. The people take longer. But the Father's house, the Bet Ave, the primal family unit that shaped every assumption you have ever made about who you are and what the world means, that is the last wall to come down. God names it last because it is the hardest, and God names it deliberately. Now think about what this means for Abram specifically. His father Terah was not just a family patriarch in the sentimental sense. According to the book of Joshua, chapter 24, verse 2, Terah was a worshiper of other gods. The text is explicit. Your ancestors, including Terah, the father of Abraham and Nahor, lived beyond the Euphrates River and worshipped other gods. This means that the father's house Abram was commanded to leave was not spiritually neutral. It was a house dedicated to the gods of Ur, to Nana and the lunar pantheon, to the whole system of divine appeasement and astral religion that Abram had grown up inside. Leaving the Bet Av was not just leaving family, it was leaving a religious inheritance. It was severing himself from a spiritual lineage that stretched back generations. And in the ancient world, that kind of severance was not just personal, it was cosmological. Your family's gods were your protection. To leave them was to walk into the world naked. And yet, there is something even more staggering buried in the promise that follows the command. After God tells Abram to leave everything, he makes a declaration in Genesis 12, verses 2 and 3 that contains one of the most remarkable statements in the entire Bible. God says, "I will make you into a great nation, and I will bless you. I will make your name great, and you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and whoever curses you, I will curse. And all peoples on earth will be blessed through you." Count the verbs. I will make. I will bless. I will make great. I will bless. I will curse. 5 divine commitments, all unconditional, all in the future tense, all contingent on nothing except Abram's departure. God is not offering a contract with mutual obligations. God is issuing a declaration, a unilateral, irrevocable restructuring of the relationship between heaven and earth, announced through one man, activated by one act of obedience. This is not how gods in the ancient world typically operated. The gods of Ur demanded constant sacrifice, constant appeasement, constant ritual performance in exchange for conditional favor. What God offers Abram here is categorically different. It is grace before the concept of grace had a name. But notice what that promise also contains. The line, "Whoever curses you, I will curse," is not a passive protective clause. It is a declaration of enmity against anyone who sets themselves against this covenant. From the moment those words were spoken, Abram became a marked man. Not just blessed, marked. Every force, human or otherwise, that would oppose the fulfillment of this promise was now in direct conflict with the God who made it. And as we are about to discover, there were forces already waiting, forces already positioned in the land God was sending Abram toward, that understood exactly what this covenant meant. The land of Canaan was not empty when God promised it to Abram. And the beings who occupied it were not merely inconvenient neighbors. They were part of a conflict so ancient, so deep, so woven into the fabric of creation itself, that the command lech-lecha was not just an invitation to a new home. It was a declaration of war. Guard that thought, because everything that happens next in Genesis depends on understanding it. There is a scene in the Bible that most people have never truly stopped to picture. Not the flood, not the parting of the sea, not the burning bush. This scene is quieter than those, and in many ways far more disturbing, because it does not announce itself with the drama those other moments carry. It happens at night. There is fire. There are animal carcasses split in half and laid out in 2 rows on the ground, and then something moves between them in the darkness, something that Abram does not approach, something that Abram is not invited to join. And when you understand what that ceremony meant in the ancient world, when you grasp the full weight of what God was doing in that moment, the comfortable image of a loving deity making a gentle promise to a faithful man shatters completely. What happens in Genesis 15 is not a blessing ceremony. It is one of the most terrifying acts of divine commitment ever recorded in human history. To understand Genesis 15, you first have to understand the covenant ritual it draws from. In the ancient Near East, binding agreements between parties were sometimes sealed through a ceremony called, in Hebrew, a Brit Bein Habitarim, which translates literally as a covenant between the pieces. The ritual worked like this. Animals were selected, killed, and cut in half, down the middle. The 2 halves were then laid on the ground facing each other, creating a corridor of flesh and blood between them. Both parties to the agreement would then walk together through that corridor, the symbolism being viscerally clear. If either party breaks this covenant, let what happened to these animals happen to them. It was a self-curse ceremony, a declaration sealed not in ink, but in the implied threat of mutual destruction. This was the most binding form of agreement the ancient world knew, and God chose it as the framework for what he was about to do with Abram. Genesis 15 opens with Abram in a state of anxiety. Despite the grand promises of chapter 12, years have passed and nothing has materially changed. Abram is still childless. Sarai is still barren. The great nation God promised seems as distant as the stars, and Abram, in one of the most honest moments in the entire patriarchal narrative, says to God in verse 2, "What can you give me, since I remain childless?" It is not quite an accusation, but it is close. It is a man holding God to his word and asking, with the quiet desperation of someone who has been waiting a very long time, when? And God responds by taking Abram outside, pointing at the night sky, and telling him to count the stars. So shall your offspring be. And then Genesis 15 verse 6 delivers one of the most theologically loaded sentences in Scripture. Abram believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. 4,000 years of theological argument compressed into a single line. But it is what happens next that nobody talks about at dinner. God instructs Abram to bring a heifer, a goat, a ram, a dove, and a young pigeon. Abram slaughters them, cuts the larger animals in half, and arranges the pieces in 2 rows, creating that ancient corridor of divided flesh. Then Abram waits, and while he waits, something strange happens. Birds of prey come down to eat the carcasses, and Abram drives them away. This detail is not decorative. In ancient Near Eastern symbolism, birds of prey descending on a sacrifice were considered a deeply ominous sign, an indication of opposing forces trying to defile or disrupt the covenant being established. Abram's act of driving them away is not a minor narrative flourish. It is his first act of covenant guardianship. He is protecting the ceremony before it has even been completed. And then, as the sun sets, something even stranger happens. A deep and terrifying darkness falls over Abram. The Hebrew word used here is ima, which does not simply mean darkness or sleep. It means a darkness filled with dread, a terror, a crushing, overwhelming, supernatural weight of fear, and inside that terror, God speaks again. But this time, what God says is not comforting. Genesis 15, verses 13 through 16, contain one of the most unflinching divine pronouncements in the entire Torah. God tells Abram that his descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, that they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years, that the nation that enslaves them will be judged, and that only after all of this will the promise be fulfilled. This is not a vision of immediate blessing. This is a preview of 4 centuries of suffering. God is not softening the road ahead. God is showing Abram the full cost of what this covenant will require before it reaches its fulfillment. And Abram, wrapped in supernatural terror in the dark beside the bodies of split animals, receives this information in silence. No protest, no negotiation, just the darkness and the voice and the weight of what is coming. Then comes the moment that should stop you completely. Genesis 15, verse 17. When the sun had set and darkness had fallen, a smoking firepot with a blazing torch appeared and passed between the pieces. Read that again, slowly. A smoking firepot, a blazing torch, moving through the corridor of divided flesh. And notice what is absent from that sentence. Abram. God told Abram to prepare the covenant. God told Abram what the covenant would cost. And then, when the moment came to walk between the pieces, to seal the agreement with the ancient self-curse, God walked through alone. Abram did not walk. Only God moved through that corridor of blood and fire. And the theological implication of that single detail is staggering. In a normal Brit Bean habitarum, both parties walk through, and both parties accept the curse that comes with breaking the covenant. But God walked alone, which means God accepted the full weight of the curse for both sides. God was saying, in the most solemn ceremony the ancient world possessed, if this covenant is ever broken, even by Abram's descendants, let it fall on me. This is why the covenant of Genesis 15 is categorically unlike anything else in ancient religion. Every other divine agreement in the ancient Near East placed the burden of faithfulness on the human party. The gods gave favor. Humans performed rituals to maintain it. If the rituals failed, the favor was withdrawn. But what God does in Genesis 15 inverts that structure entirely. God binds himself. God accepts the curse. God makes the covenant irrevocable, not by demanding perfect human obedience, but by voluntarily absorbing the consequence of human failure before it ever occurs. And if you are a reader who knows how the rest of the biblical story unfolds, if you know what happens on a hill outside Jerusalem 2,000 years later, then you already understand what that smoking firepot and blazing torch were pointing toward. The covenant written in blood and fire in Genesis 15 was not a one-time ceremony. It was a prophecy. And the one who walked between the pieces in the dark was already planning from that moment exactly how he intended to keep it. Here is something that almost no one notices when they read Genesis 12. for the first time. The ink is barely dry on the most consequential promise in human history. God has just declared that Abram will become a great nation, that all peoples on earth will be blessed through him, that whoever curses him will be cursed. The covenant has been spoken, the mission has been defined. And then, within the space of just a few verses, everything goes wrong. Abram arrives in Canaan and immediately encounters famine. He descends into Egypt to survive. His wife is taken into Pharaoh's palace, plagues strike the royal household, and Abram leaves Egypt under a cloud of suspicion and moral compromise. If you were reading this as a story about divine favor, this opening sequence would feel like a catastrophic failure, but it is not a failure. It is the first engagement in a war. And once you see it as that, the entire narrative of the patriarchs begins to make a different kind of sense entirely. Let us slow down and look at what actually happens in Genesis 12, verses 10 through 20, because the details are more loaded than they first appear. Abram enters Egypt and immediately faces a decision rooted in fear. He tells Sarai to say she is his sister, not his wife, because he is afraid that the Egyptians will kill him to take her. Now, on the surface, this looks like a straightforward act of cowardice, and many readers and preachers have treated it that way. But consider the context. Sarai, according to Genesis 12, verse 11, was a woman of extraordinary beauty. In the ancient Near East, beauty in a woman of high status was not a personal attribute. It was a political currency. Kings and rulers collected beautiful women as symbols of divine favor and earthly power. For Pharaoh to acquire Sarai was not just a personal desire, it was a statement of dominance. And if Abram had identified himself as her husband, he would have been an obstacle to be removed. The fear was not irrational. It was a precise reading of a very real danger. But here is what makes this episode genuinely strange. God had just promised Abram that his descendants would be as numerous as the stars. That promise required Sarai. Without Sarai, there is no Isaac. Without Isaac, there is no Jacob. Without Jacob, there is no Israel. Without Israel, there is no covenant lineage, no promised land, no prophetic fulfillment, and ultimately, no Messiah. Sarai was not just Abram's wife. She was the biological vessel through whom the entire promise of Genesis 12 was going to be delivered, and she was now inside Pharaoh's palace. Which raises a question that should make you deeply uncomfortable. Was this a coincidence? Was the famine that drove Abram to Egypt a natural event? Or was it the first move in a strategic attempt to intercept the covenant before it could produce its first generation? Was Pharaoh acting on his own appetites, or was he, without knowing it, a piece on a board being moved by forces far older and far more deliberate than any Egyptian king? The Bible does not answer that question directly, but it does something almost more interesting. It shows you how God responds. Genesis 12, verse 17, says that the Lord inflicted serious diseases on Pharaoh and his household because of Abram's wife Sarai. Not a mild inconvenience, not a polite divine nudge. Serious diseases, plagues striking a royal palace. The same word used here for the plagues on Pharaoh's house, negaim in Hebrew, is related to the language used later in Exodus to describe the plagues on all of Egypt. This is not a coincidence of vocabulary. The author of Genesis is drawing a deliberate connection. The pattern established in chapter 12, a threat to the covenant carrier, a divine intervention through plague, a forced release and departure, will be replicated on a national scale 400 years later. What happens to Sarai in Pharaoh's palace is a miniature preview of what will happen to all of Israel in Egyptian bondage. The patterns in Genesis are not just history. They are templates. And this pattern of immediate opposition following covenant declaration does not stop in Egypt. It is woven through every major moment in Abram's life after Genesis 12. He returns from Egypt, and conflict breaks out between his herdsmen and Lot's herdsmen, forcing a separation. He is drawn into a war between 4 kings and 5 kings in Genesis 14, a conflict he had no part in starting, but finds himself at the center of. His wife remains barren for decade after decade, while the promise of a great nation hangs in the air like an unfulfilled guarantee. And in Genesis 16, in an act of desperate human logic, Sarai offers her servant Hagar to Abram, producing Ishmael, a son who will become the father of a people in perpetual tension with the covenant line. Every step forward in the promise seems to generate a new complication, a new threat, a new opposing force. Does that sound like the unfolding of divine blessing? Or does it sound like a war in which one side keeps pressing and the other side keeps being defended by something it cannot fully see? Now bring in a source that sits outside the canonical text, but illuminates it in ways that are deeply relevant. The Book of Jubilees, an ancient Jewish text from approximately the 2nd century before Christ, retells the story of Abram with additional details that the canonical Genesis omits. In the Jubilees account, the threats against Abram are not random. They are orchestrated. There is a figure in Jubilees called Mastema, a prosecutorial adversary whose specific role is to test and oppose the covenant people by any means available. When Abram enters Egypt, when famine strikes, when Sarai is endangered, the Jubilees tradition suggests that these events are not happening in a vacuum. They are happening within an invisible conflict between the purposes of God and the forces arrayed against those purposes. The canonical text keeps this background war largely off stage, but it leaves enough traces that if you know where to look, you can see the outline of it clearly. And here is where this becomes relevant, not just as ancient history, but as a living pattern. Think about what Genesis 12 establishes structurally. The moment a divine purpose is declared, opposition activates. The moment a covenant is spoken, an attempt to break it begins. The moment a promise is issued, a counter-strategy is deployed against the person who carries it. This is not unique to Abram. It is the consistent experience of every major figure in the biblical narrative who carries a significant divine assignment. Moses is targeted at birth. David is hunted for years before he reaches the throne. The infant Jesus is nearly killed by Herod within the first 2 years of his life. The pattern is not coincidental, it is systematic. And once you see it in Genesis 12, once you recognize that the opposition Abram faced was not circumstantial bad luck, but a direct response to the covenant that had just been declared over his life, you begin to ask a question that the text seems to be deliberately building toward. If these forces oppose the promise, then, with such speed and such precision, what are they doing now? And who, in this generation, is carrying something worth opposing? There is a single word in Genesis 12, verse 7, that most English readers pass over without a second thought. God appears to Abram and says, "To your offspring I will give this land." Offspring, simple enough. But the Hebrew word behind that translation is zerah, and zerah does not simply mean children or descendants in the general sense that English implies. Zerah means seed, one seed, a singular, specific biological unit of continuation. And the moment you understand that the promise God made to Abram in Genesis 12 was never primarily about a nation or a people group, but about a single seed moving through history toward a specific destination, the entire Old Testament reorganizes itself around a terrifying central conflict. Because if there is a seed being protected and guided toward a purpose, then there is also something trying to prevent that seed from ever arriving. And that conflict did not begin with Abram. It began in a garden with a serpent and a curse that split the future of the world in two. Go back to Genesis 3, verse 15. This is the verse that biblical scholars call the proto-evangelium, which means the first gospel, the first announcement of what the rest of Scripture will be about. God speaks to the serpent after the fall and says, "I will put enmity between you and the woman, and between your offspring and hers. He will crush your head, and you will strike his heel." Two seeds, the seed of the woman and the seed of the serpent, and between them not a disagreement or a rivalry, but enmity. The Hebrew word used is ibah, which carries the force of deep, implacable, structural hostility. This is not a metaphor for human moral struggle. This is a declaration of cosmic war between two biological and spiritual lineages that will run in parallel through all of human history until one of them delivers the decisive blow. Genesis 3, verse 15, is the frame inside which everything that happens in Genesis 12 must be understood. The promise to Abram is not a new story. It is the continuation of a conflict that was already ancient when Abram was born. Now look at what God says in Genesis 12, verse 3 with fresh eyes. "All peoples on earth will be blessed through you." The Hebrew construction here is nifberechu, which can be translated as will be blessed or will bless themselves. But the Apostle Paul, writing in Galatians 3, verse 16, makes an observation about this promise that is either a brilliant insight or one of the most consequential interpretive claims in the history of theology. Paul writes, "The promises were spoken to Abraham and to his seed." Scripture does not say "and to seeds," meaning many people, but "and to your seed," meaning one person, who is Christ. Paul is saying that the singular word zerah in the Abrahamic promise was always pointing to a single individual, that the blessing promised to all nations through Abram was always going to be delivered through one specific descendant, which means the entire covenant of Genesis 12 was, from its first utterance, a roadmap with a single destination, and every generation of that bloodline, from Abram to Isaac to Jacob to Judah to David, was a link in a chain being protected, guided, and repeatedly attacked as it moved toward that end point. This is why the land of Canaan matters so much more than most people realize. When God promises the land of Canaan to Abram's descendants, it is easy to read that as a simple real estate transaction. A people need a home. God provides one. But look at what Genesis 12, verse 6 says about the land when Abram first arrives there. It says, almost as an aside, "At that time the Canaanites were in the land." 4 words that are doing enormous work. The land was not empty. It was occupied, and the people occupying it were not neutral parties who happened to be living in the wrong place at the wrong time. The Canaanites and more specifically the various peoples listed throughout the patriarchal narratives as inhabitants of that land: the Rephaim, the Anakim, the Nephilim, the Amorites, were connected in ancient tradition to a corruption of the human bloodline that ran all the way back to the events described in Genesis 6, where the sons of God took wives from among human women and produced a hybrid offspring that Genesis calls the Nephilim. The Promised Land was not just a geographical inheritance, it was a contested spiritual territory occupied by the descendants of the opposing seed. The Book of Enoch, one of the most significant texts from the ancient Jewish world outside the canonical Bible, expands dramatically on Genesis 6 and its aftermath. Enoch describes in detail the Watchers, the angelic beings who descended to earth, who taught humanity forbidden knowledge, and whose offspring, the Nephilim, corrupted the genetic and spiritual integrity of humanity to such an extent that the flood became necessary as a cosmic reset. But Enoch also makes clear that the flood did not end the problem entirely. The spirits of the Nephilim, according to this tradition, persisted after their physical bodies were destroyed, becoming the disembodied entities that later traditions would call demons. And the regions where the Nephilim had been most concentrated, where their physical descendants had most deeply embedded themselves into the landscape and population, became the most spiritually contested territories on earth. Canaan was chief among them. God was not sending Abram to an empty land with a complicated political situation. God was sending the carrier of the covenant seed directly into the heart of the opposing seed's strongest territory. And he did it deliberately. Numbers 13, verse 33, records the report of the spies sent into Canaan centuries after Abram. And even then, after generations had passed, the spies returned saying, "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." The giants were still there. The opposing lineage had not been eliminated, it had dug in. It had fortified itself in the very territory that the seed of Abram was destined to inherit. And this explains something that has troubled Bible readers for centuries: the divine command to utterly destroy the Canaanite peoples when Israel finally entered the land under Joshua. To modern readers, those commands sound like ethnic cleansing. But in the framework of the seed war, established in Genesis 3 and carried forward through Genesis 12, they look different. They look like a surgical removal of the biological and spiritual infrastructure of the opposing lineage from the territory through which the covenant seed was meant to pass on its way to its ultimate destination. Now bring this all the way back to Abram standing in Canaan for the first time in Genesis 12, verse 7, receiving the promise that this land will belong to his descendants. He is standing in contested territory. He is a single man with a barren wife and no children. Around him are cities and peoples with roots in a corruption of humanity that predates even the flood. And God is telling him, this is yours. Not yet. Not in your lifetime, but yours. The audacity of that promise, when you understand what the land actually contained, is breathtaking. This was not God handing Abram an empty field. This was God planting the carrier of the covenant seed in the middle of the enemy's stronghold and saying, this is where it begins. Guard the seed. Protect the line. Because what is growing in you is the answer to a question that was asked in a garden before your grandfather's grandfather was born. And the forces that heard God make that promise in Genesis 12 understood exactly what it meant. The question is whether you do. Remember the question we asked at the very beginning. Why does the most famous call in the Bible carry an undercurrent of terror? Why does a passage that most people read as an inspiring story of faith leave, when examined closely, a residue of dread that no amount of Sunday school framing can fully dissolve? We have spent this entire journey building toward the answer, and now we are here. We have seen the world Abram left behind, a civilization soaked in blood ritual and astral religion. We have felt the full weight of lech-lecha, a command that dismantled a man's identity before it gave him a destination. We have stood in the dark beside split animal carcasses and watched fire move through them alone. We have traced the seed war from Eden to Canaan, from the garden to the giants, from the first promise to the first attempt to destroy it. And now it is time to ask the question that all of this was always building toward. Why was this written down? Why did God preserve this story across 4,000 years of history through conquest and exile and dispersion and translation so that you could be sitting here reading it right now? Jesus answered that question directly. In Matthew 24, verse 37, he said, "As it was in the days of Noah, so it will be at the coming of the Son of Man." He did not say as it was in the days of Moses. He did not point to the Exodus or the conquest of Canaan or the reign of Solomon. He pointed specifically to the era that Genesis 6 through 12 describes. The era of the Watchers and the Nephilim. The era of genetic corruption and civilizational collapse. The era of a world so thoroughly infiltrated by the opposing seed that only a catastrophic divine intervention could reset the trajectory of humanity. And he said, that is what the end will look like, not metaphorically, not as a vague spiritual parallel, as a structural template for the conditions that will exist on the earth immediately before the most significant event in human history. If that does not make you sit up straighter, read it again. Now look at the world around you, not through the lens of any particular political ideology or cultural narrative, but through the lens of the patterns established in Genesis. In the era before Noah, according to Genesis 6, the primary corruption was biological. The boundaries between human and non-human were being systematically dissolved. The integrity of the human form as God had designed it was being compromised at the most fundamental level. Today, for the first time in recorded history since that era, humanity possesses the technological capability to edit the human genome. CRISPR technology, first developed in the early 2010s, allows scientists to cut and rewrite the base pairs of human DNA with a precision that previous generations could not have imagined. Designer embryos are no longer fiction. They are laboratory reality. The boundary between human and non-human biological material is being actively dissolved in research facilities on every inhabited continent. Jesus said the end would be like the days of Noah. The days of Noah were defined by exactly this. Coincidence? But the parallel does not stop at genetics. In the era of Abram, the world was organized around a system of territorial spiritual powers, what the Hebrew Bible calls the Elohim of the nations, divine beings to whom God had assigned governance over the peoples of the earth after the Tower of Babel, according to Deuteronomy 32, verse 8. These powers were not benevolent administrators. They were, according to Psalm 82, corrupt rulers who had perverted justice, favored the wicked, and bound the nations under systems of spiritual and political oppression. The entire mission of the Abrahamic covenant was to create a counterlineage, a people directly under the governance of the God of Israel rather than the Elohim of the nations, through whom the seed would travel to its destination and ultimately reclaim what the corrupt powers had stolen. Now look at the global order today. Look at the concentration of power, the erosion of the structures that once distributed authority across independent nations, the acceleration towards systems of unified global governance that would have been technically impossible just 50 years ago. The architecture of what the biblical prophets described as the final world system is assembling itself in real time, in plain sight, with a speed that feels less like historical drift and more like intentional construction. And here is where Genesis 12 becomes personally terrifying in a way that no doctrinal argument can replicate. The covenant God made with Abram was not just about a nation or a land or a historical event that concluded 2,000 years ago. The Apostle Paul writes in Galatians 3, verse 29, "If you belong to Christ, then you are Abraham's seed and heirs according to the promise." If the seed war established in Genesis 3 and carried through Genesis 12 is still active, and the evidence suggests overwhelmingly that it is, then everyone who carries the covenant of that seed in the present age is living inside the same pattern that Abram lived inside, the same dynamic that produced famine the moment Abram entered Canaan, the same dynamic that put Sarai in Pharaoh's palace the moment the promise needed her most, the same opposition that activated the instant the covenant was declared is still operating. It has never stopped. It simply changes its instruments in every generation, while the underlying strategy remains identical. Find the carrier of the promise and interrupt the line before the seed reaches its destination. This is why the terrifying verse in Genesis 12 is terrifying not just historically, but personally. Go back to it one final time. Lech-lecha. Go, for your own sake. Leave what is comfortable. Leave what is familiar. Leave even what feels like home, if what feels like home is keeping you from becoming what you are made to be. The command God gave Abram was not a one-time historical instruction. It is a pattern that the biblical narrative presents as the entry point into covenant relationship in every generation. Before the blessing, the departure. Before the promise, the severing. Before the seed can move toward its destination, the person carrying it must be willing to let go of every identity that the world, the culture, the family, the system has constructed around them, and walk into the terrifying freedom of a destination not yet revealed. Abram did it in the physical world, leaving Ur. You are being asked to do it in every dimension of your life that is still Ur. The story of Genesis 12 was not preserved for 4,000 years so that theologians could debate its documentary sources. It was not written down so that preachers could use it as a motivational illustration about following your dreams. It was preserved because it is a warning and an invitation delivered across the full span of human history to every person alive in the generation when the patterns it describes reach their final convergence. The seed war is entering its last phase. The conditions Jesus described are assembling. The forces that opposed Abram are not retired. They are more active, more technically sophisticated, and more broadly empowered than at any previous point in recorded history. And the God who walked alone between the pieces in the dark, who absorbed the full weight of the covenant curse so that the promise could never be broken, is still moving. still protecting the line, still calling individuals by name out of their out of their comfort, out of their inherited systems of false worship, and into something that has no map and no guaranteed safety and no destination written on a sign. Only a voice. And the question that Genesis 12 has always been asking, across every century, in every language, to every person with ears to hear it, is the same question it is asking you right now. When the voice comes, and it will come, what will you do with the silence before your first step